Hi, good afternoon. This is Rob Bell, and you're watching Getting the Record Straight. This is the Black Rock and Soul edition or segment, and I'd like to welcome you. Hope you're staying safe and navigating around this coronavirus. I know a lot of you, including myself, have to get out and about, whether we want to or not. And I've got my little mask. In fact, someone just made me one. We'll have to see how that works. But at any rate, I hope you're staying safe. This thing has become serious, and we've got to do the best we can. I hope that you are going to my website, www.blackrocksoul.com, and listening to the playlist. It takes you to my YouTube playlist, Black Rock and Soul playlist, and really try to provide you with a very diverse group of listing, rather, of music, particularly music that hails from the black music community. Um, that would be jazz, rock, um, soul, funk, all of that kind of good stuff. And I try to put together a nice blend that keeps you moving and keeps you thinking. Because I try to put out there innovative music and music that's somewhat controversial, music that has a message. I think that's important. I know when I was coming up, and certainly in college in the 70s, a lot of what we listened to was music that had a message to it, music that dug a little deeper than the surface. Of course, that's when Gil Scott Heron really emerged and became a star. The Last Poets, Roy Ayers, many artists, the OJs, much of what came out of Philadelphia International had a message to it. And we try to revisit that and bring it to the fore on, the Black Rock and Soul playlist. If there's any problem, people often say to me, some of my colleagues, that music isn't what it used to be. The artists aren't what they used to be. I'm sorry. There's a lot of great music out there, and in addition to playing the '70s stuff, I really do try to get into a lot of more contemporary music, a lot of hip hop and jazz, hip hop and funk, and and a lot of spoken word artists and music. And the thing is that there are great poets out there. There's great musicians. There's great singers and vocalists and rappers and poets. The thing is that conventional mainstream radio is just horrific, and that's really what brought me to this point to do the Black Rock and Soul playlist, is to really show that there's great music. There still is significant music that keeps you bumping, and but will make you think. And it's not the artist; it's the exposure. There just aren't, in terms of mainstream radio, enough outlets and people willing to take a chance. A playlist are very narrow and limited, and I put together on average 25 to 30 records over 2 hours of music. And although there's some great old stuff, like I said, back in the late 60s and 70s, there's just a wonderful cadre of younger artists who just don't get airtime. And in Philadelphia, it's particularly annoying because you have some great young artists who aren't who are getting older. They're not so young anymore, but they've never really had the exposure, never really had the platform here in Philly, in particular. And but just to give you a sampling of, let me see what I have on right now, is a classic by Charles Wright and the 103rd Street Rhythm Band, "Do Your Thing," a classic. There's some older stuff from some of the Black Eyed Peas early music. A guy by the name of Citizen Cope, Marlene Rosenberg is a bassist. and I got a really nice piece on there by her. By the way, I often refer to black music when I talk about my music playlist, but oftentimes there's people on there who are not African American, but they're playing soulful, jazzy music that emanated from what I say is the black music community, the black music legacy, if you will. And so I don't do the, I'm just going to play black artists. I think imitation is the greatest form of, and I'm forgetting that phrase, but whatever it is, but you know what I'm saying. Um, so that's what I do. I give the black music legacy exposure through many artists. Some of them are, I just was listening to an Asian Japanese player um, the other day, and I will probably play them sometime soon. So you get that. Still trying to think of that phrase, but it'll come to me. Anyway, I think you know what I'm talking about. So again, stay safe. Check into the. You go through the easiest way to get to the YouTube playlist is to go through the website. So go to blackrocksoul.com, hit the button for BRS playlists, and it'll bring you to the YouTube music playlist, and it'll also get you here to see the Getting the Record Straight video. With that in mind, just want to kind of tie up a few things. Well, one thing I do want to say is I think next week will be our first phone interview. I'm going to try to get on a guy who's really been a bit of a legend in terms of providing underground music, the music that I love anyway, from one of the college radio stations here. Got to see if I can get him though, but he's been a big influence on me in terms of keeping me hip to what's going on that's not mainstream. So I'm going to see if I can get Al Knight here next week. Um, um, when we last spoke, I think I talked a bit about the different areas that were coming out of the initial rock and roll era from 45 to 55, and that was changing over in 1960, and the movement of in terms of the black African American music movement as related to rock and roll, that segment was moving into primarily three geographic areas, and then I talked about the fact that also in the South, you had James Brown kind of doing his own thing, and really putting together a rhythmic pattern that would revolutionize music. Um, that said, so you had Motown, Detroit, Chicago, and Memphis, um, and what they were a burgeoning music scene around those three areas, and of course nationally there were other areas that were developing their sound, black sound, that was included, that was part of the whole rock and roll movement. And of course, the rockabilly movement, which was part of that, had waned and died down by 1960 for a number of reasons. I talked about the plane crash, but what I may not have mentioned was Elvis went to, I think, the Army in '59 or something like that. Jerry Lee Lewis, who was part of that strain of rock and roll, that genre of rock and roll. He got caught with his cousin or married his cousin, something that kind of took him out of the scene. So a lot of the major artists of rockabilly, like I said, were no longer relevant, and certainly were not in the mainstream in the beginning of the decade in 1960. But on the black side of things and what was happening in that movement, was quite a lot developing in the areas that I spoke of. So we talked about Chicago, and I kind of went into a few things about Chicago. In particular, I started talking about arrangers and arrangements and how important that was in the music that was coming out with respect to, as I call it, black rock and roll, soul music of the 60s. Arrangements was particularly important and critical, and the arrangers, the people who were responsible, often who were also producers, was a critical element of the music at that time, particularly in Detroit and Chicago. And I mentioned Johnny Pate and Charles Stepney. And I did want to ask you, if you get a chance, if you really want to hear two records that are amazing. They're amazing records. But it wasn't until, for me, till I got much older and listened to those records again in my 50s, that you really hear this arrangement, brilliance and genius that is part of that of those records. And the two records that come to mind are "Choice of Colors," which is by the Impressions, and of course Curtis Mayfield. And I'm not sure who did the arrangements on that. It may have been Johnny Pate because he was with that record company at the time in Chicago, and and it might have been Kurt Tome, which was Curtis Mayfield's label, but I'm not sure. But at any rate, if you get a chance, you can look on, you can go to YouTube and probably find a video of Choice of Colors. But you really need to listen to it because it's an amazing arrangement and just a tremendous record. And what's really interesting to me is that you wouldn't really think of it, but the drummer, and again, I wouldn't know who that was probably a studio drummer on that particular cut, is just out, out of this world. And you're talking about a fairly slow piece, it's a slow tempo kind of song, but the drummer on it is amazing. It's incredible. The other one I think of, again, out of that Chicago sound, another record is "I Can Sing a Rainbow" by the Dells. Another, yeah, I mean, it's like a 5-minute masterpiece. It actually has movements to it, I think. And it's a great, great record. The arrangement is amazing, something that could be played at a Philharmonic orchestra concert. So get a hold of those if you can and listen to just the changes and the orchestration, the arrangements of these two records, and then try to find out who actually did the arrangements. I actually should have before I did this, but they are two amazing records. Before we leave talking about Chicago, I did want to mention again some of the greats in the 60s who came out of Chicago from the various labels, Chess and others. But Ramsey Lewis, great jazz artist, and one of the first guys to kind of cross over jazz into a soul or pop, genre, and was getting fans. He was a million seller, artist. And of course, the other thing that made Ramsey so great was that Maurice White, the legend who started Earth, Wind and Fire, actually started as a session drummer with Ramsey Lewis. The Ramsey Lewis Trio, actually, it was called. And so Ramsey Lewis, Rotary Connection was another great band that came out of Chicago, the late 60s. And of course, that's where Minnie Riperton started with that band. Not a lot of hits, but really some great music, interesting stuff. You get a chance to check them out. Of course, Rufus and Chaka Khan, out of Chicago, the Five Stairsteps, and one of my favorites, the Dells. All Chicago, all in the 60s, and part of a movement that was going on. Was part of, in my opinion, rock and roll. Well, not in my opinion, a fact. They were part of rock and roll, but what I would call black rock and roll or soul music at that time. That's all we have time for, and this has been Getting the Record Straight. I'm Rob Bell. Take care. Bye-bye.